Well, we're going to be talking about the fourth of the loves. Really, he calls it the third love. But really, if you count epithumia in the four loves by C.S. Lewis, you'll find that that's a love and for things that are subhuman. And it could be music as well, various kinds of love. I love chocolate, that kind of a thing. So that's how he began. And then he moves into the love of storge, S-T-O-R-G-E, but it means affection. And he talks about how it has its own treasures and values, but it also has its own downsides. And indeed, he's going to argue that each of the human loves contains the seeds of its own unique forms of hatred if it's not animated and energized by the highest of loves, the divine love of charity or agape. So each one has its own distorted downside. It makes perfect sense. So we move from storge, he then moved on to the love of friendship, phileo, and talked about how that has its own unique qualities, very different. Can't be reduced to one or the other. Each of them has a unique bouquet, as it were, of loves. And that's why the Greek language has more words for love by far than we do, and it's a richer vision of what they look like. And so you have a bouquet of loves. So the love of friendship, and then we're now looking at the love of eros. And erotic love, we might call it, but eros is more than just Venus, what he's going to call Venus. He says, the carnal or animally sexual element within eros, I intend, following an old usage, to call Venus. And so he's talking about that, but he's going to draw a distinction between the two because often people reduce it. By eros, which is another one of the words not used in the New Testament Greek. The Greek New Testament uses phileo and agape, but it does not use storge and eros. It's interesting. But they were widely used, and so it's not as though they couldn't have been used. But in this eros, it's what is called being in love, you see. So it's the kind of love in which lovers are in. So that's the problem. If you fall in love, you can fall out of love. You see these falling in and out. So there's a kind of an extra dimension that doesn't sustain itself. He says sexuality makes part of our subject only when it becomes an ingredient in the complex state of being in love. That sexual experience can occur without eros, without being in love, and that eros includes other things besides sexual activity I take for granted. And so he's going to be arguing that sexuality may operate without eros or as part of eros. And so he says, I'm not all subscribing to the popular idea that it is the absence or presence of eros which makes the sexual act impure or pure, degraded or fine, lawful or unlawful. No, there are different kinds of aspects there. He says the times and places in which marriage depends on eros are really in a small minority. If you stop and think about it. When you're looking at marriage, when you're looking at that kind of relationship of eros, the Venus component is not that big a deal in comparison to so many other activities. Most of our ancestors, in fact, he says, were married off in early youth to partners chosen by their parents on grounds that had nothing to do with eros. And as you know, even now, in the majority of countries, there are these arranged marriages, and because of that, people learn to come to love one another, is the idea, you see, because they don't love each other, they just met each other in a strange way. So there's a kind of a cultural ethos that expects something more that would have emerged from that. He goes on to say, and I'm going to be skipping around a lot because it's a big chapter, but and Lewis is so elegant in the way he describes these things. You can get caught off into all these little territories, these rabbit trails, as Bick Cardwell likes to call them, my bunny trails. But there you are. George Orwell, though, he says, disliked the idea of this eros and preferred sexuality in its native condition, uncontaminated by eros. So in his 1984, his dreadful hero, and he says, how much less human than the four-footed heroes of his excellent animal form? It's interesting because that's actually a better book. But he says, sexual desire without eros wants it, the thing in itself. Eros wants the beloved. There's a very big difference, as you can see. The thing is sensory pleasure. But what he's saying is, when he says he wants a woman, strictly speaking, it's not a woman that he wants. He wants a pleasure for which the woman happens to be the necessary piece of apparatus. So and then when a person is through with a carton of cigarettes, he pitches the carton. Now, Eros makes a man really want, not a woman, but one particular woman. Different kind of an understanding, you see. In some mysterious but quite indisputable fashion, the lover desires the beloved herself, not the pleasure she can give. So it's a higher, different kind of a thing. There are physical, organic dynamics of it, which the Venus describes, but it's much, much more than that. So he says, Eros thus wonderfully transforms what is par excellence a need pleasure into the most appreciative of pleasures, and